Hello and thank you for tuning into this week's episode of Bite-Sized Cybercrime. I skipped last week because I was at Blue Team Con in Chicago over the weekend. It's a smaller cybersecurity conference for defenders, but I had a pretty great time. Met some really cool people and listened to some wonderful talks. But this week we are back and we're going to be talking about a vulnerability that dropped while I was on my small break, which is an unfixable vulnerability in YubiKey's YubiKey product. Now, what exactly is a YubiKey? A YubiKey is a hardware authentication device that supports multiple protocols like one-time passwords and FIDO. These tokens provide easy two-factor authentication, and ideally, they cannot be cloned, as that compromises the confidentiality of the data they are used to access. Unfortunately, though, that is exactly the vulnerability that was discovered. The vulnerability only exists in the YubiKey 5 series because it uses the Infineon crypto library, which is where the vulnerability truly lies. A crypto library doesn't really have much to do with cryptocurrency. Rather, it's a library that allows the implementation of encryption. These authentication codes should be encrypted so that even if the device is stolen, they can't be uncovered. But there's a flaw in the crypto library itself. An attacker can extract secret keys used in the elliptic curve digital signature algorithm to essentially clone the device. The good news is that this is actually really hard to do, even for an experienced hacker. It requires physical access to the YubiKey itself, as well as specialized equipment and a very high-level understanding of both electronics and mathematics. And a lot of hackers are no mathematicians. So, how does this attack work? Researchers at Ninja Lab discovered it and outlined it as such. First, an attacker steals the login and password of a victim's account, which you can do through a phishing attack pretty easily. Next, the YubiKey itself needs to be taken, which is when the attacker sends many authentication requests to the YubiKey while performing side-channel measurements. To put it simply, this is just measuring the output of what happens while authenticating. To do this, you'd basically have to take the key apart and expose the board inside, as you'd need to connect to a chip to actually collect these measurements. Once all the necessary data is collected, the device is returned to the owner, ideally without them knowing anything has gone wrong, so you'd also need to reassemble the key perfectly, or at least good enough that the owner wouldn't notice it had been tampered with. With the measurements taken, a side-channel attack can be performed to extract the private keys linked to the account that the token was authenticating with. This can then be used to create a clone of the YubiKey. As I said, this is a pretty difficult to exploit vulnerability, especially when you consider most hackers don't have physical access to anything you have. In response, YubiKey posted an advisory warning about the vulnerability and mentioned the versions of the YubiKey that are impacted. This is generally the Series 5 keys prior to firmware version 5.7. Firmware versions can be checked using the YubiKey Manager desktop app. Now, typically in a situation like this, vendors would be releasing a patch, but this is actually not possible for the YubiKey. So, YubiKey 5 series prior to the 5.7 version are just going to be vulnerable forever. If the level of risk this vulnerability provides is too high for comfort, the best course of action is going to simply be to replace it with a different model. Even though this vulnerability is scored as a medium risk, I would say it's actually lower than that. And I say this mostly because a vast majority of hackers are not going to be physically near you. The most prolific hackers we hear about in the news at least are either based out of Russia, China, North Korea, or Iran. It is always possible that someone can break into your home or office, but even if they do, are they going to know about this vulnerability and have the expertise to actually pull it off? Especially considering you need some kind of credentials in the first place to do so? There's still certainly some amount of risk, and yeah, hackers can exist in the country you live in as well. Physical penetration tests, where people bypass building security and try to steal things from offices, are also not so uncommon that this would be completely unheard of to be exploited in the wild. When it comes to physical security, I think there's much bigger issues than this specific YubiKey vulnerability, but it is still really interesting to hear about how this works, so thank you to Ninja Lab for discovering this attack and documenting it thoroughly, as well as Bleeping Computer, ARS Technica, Security Week, and The Verge for reporting on this case and its implications. And of course, thank you for tuning into this week's episode of Bite-Sized Cybercrime. My name is Chloe Tonis, and until next time, stay secure.